The infant's cry pierced through the pre-dawn silence like a blade through silk. Preacher Simon Caldwell's eyes snapped open in his modest quarters behind the weathered wooden church, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment he thought, it might be the wind playing tricks through the bell tower. But the sound came again, desperate, raw, unmistakably human. Simon's bare feet hit the cold floorboards with urgency. He'd been ministering to the farming community of Millbrook Valley for 8 years, and never once had someone come calling at this ungodly hour. The cry echoed again, weaker now, and something primal in his chest twisted with alarm. He threw on his woolen coat and rushed through the narrow corridor that connected his living quarters to the main sanctuary. The heavy oak doors groaned as he pulled them open, and there, wrapped in a tattered quilt on the stone steps, lay a baby girl. Sweet merciful Lord, he breathed. Dropping to his knees beside the bundle, the child couldn't have been more than a few days old. Her tiny fists waved in the frigid October air, her face red from crying and cold. A note was pinned to the quilt in shaky handwriting. Her name is Rose. Please give her what I cannot. Simon's hands trembled as he lifted the baby, cradling her. Against his chest, she quieted almost instantly, her small body relaxing into his warmth. At 32, he'd never held an infant before, never imagined the weight of such complete vulnerability in his arms. Hush now, little Rose, he whispered, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. You're safe now. As dawn broke over the rolling hills that surrounded Millbrook Valley, Simon sat in the front pew of his church, Rose sleeping peacefully in his lap. The logical part of his mind raced through practical concerns. He needed milk, proper clothing, cradle boards, medical attention. But deeper than logic, something had shifted in his very soul the moment he'd seen her on those steps. The church. Doors creaked open, and Widow Persimmon shuffled in for morning prayers, her black shawl draped over silver hair. Preacher Caldwell? Her voice carried a note of confusion. What in heaven's name someone left her here, Cordelia, Simon said. Softly, not taking his eyes off Rose's peaceful face. Left her for us to find. The old woman's expression softened as she approached, her weathered hands reaching out to touch the baby's cheek. Poor little lamb. What will you do with her? Simon looked up, and Cordelia was struck by something she'd never seen in the young preacher's eyes before, fierce, protective love that seemed to transform his entire countenance. I'm going to raise her, he said simply. God brought her to my doorstep. That's not chance, Cordelia. That's providence. The widow studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. The baby needs more than prayers and good intentions. As the morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting Rose's tiny features in jeweled colors, Simon made a silent vow. This child would know love, security, and purpose. She would grow up surrounded by the warmth of community and faith. He had no idea that 17 years later, that same protective love would transform into something far more complicated and dangerous to his very calling. 17 years had changed everything and nothing in Millbrook Valley. The wheat still grew golden in late summer, the church bell still called the faithful to worship, Preacher Simon Caldwell still delivered sermons that stirred souls and mended hearts. But Rose Caldwell had grown into something that made the village. Women whisper behind their hands and the young men stumble over their own feet. Simon tried not to notice the way her auburn hair caught the light as she arranged wildflowers on the altar, or how her laughter during the church social made his chest tight with an emotion he refused to name. She moved through their small home with an easy grace, cooking his meals, mending his clothes, discussing scripture with an intelligence that both impressed and unsettled him. You're wool gathering again, Rose teased, catching him staring as she ladled soup into his bowl. The autumn evening cast shadows across her heart-shaped face, and Simon forced himself to look away. Just tired, he muttered, though they both knew it was a lie. These moments had become more frequent stolen glances, lingering touches when she handed him papers. Conversations that stretched far into the night about theology and life and dreams that neither of them dared voice. Rose set down the ladle with deliberate care. Jeremiah Thornton asked Father McKinnon to speak with you. Simon's spoon clattered against his bowl. Jeremiah Thornton owned the largest farm in 3 counties, and his interest in Rose had been apparent for months. What about, you know what? About. Rose's voice carried a note of challenge that made Simon's stomach knot. He wants to court me properly. With your permission. The words hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Simon found himself rising from his chair, pacing to the window that overlooked the moonlit cemetery behind the church. He could see his reflection in the glass, still young at 49. His dark hair only lightly touched with silver, his shoulders broad from years of farm work before his calling. You're 18 now, he said carefully. Old enough to make your own choices. That's not what I asked. Rose's footsteps approached behind him, and he could smell the lavender soap she'd taken to using. I asked what you thought about Jeremiah Thornton. Simon closed his eyes, fighting against the jealousy that clawed at his insides like a living thing. Jeremiah was a good man, prosperous, faithful, exactly the kind of husband any father would want for his daughter. Except Simon wasn't Rose's father, not really. And the feelings that had been growing in his heart for months now had nothing paternal about them. He's a fine man, Simon managed. He could provide for you, give you children a proper home. I have a home. Rose's voice was barely above a whisper. Here with you. The simple words hit him like a physical blow. Simon turned slowly, and the look in Rose's green eyes made his breath catch. There was no innocence there, no childish devotion. What he saw was the gaze of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and what she wanted was him. Rose, he began, but she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I know what I am to this village, she said quietly. I'm the foundling you took in out of Christian charity. But I also know what I am to you, Simon. I see how you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Simon's hands trembled at his sides. Every principle he'd built his life upon screamed at him to step away, to remind her of propriety, of his calling, of the impossibility of what she was suggesting. Instead, he found himself reaching out to cup her face in his palm. This is madness, he whispered. Rose leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. Then, let's be mad together. The distance between them seemed to collapse, and for one dangerous moment, Simon forgot everything except the woman standing before him and the love that threatened to consume them both. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it shattered Simon's world like glass against stone. The moment their lips touched, 17 years of careful boundaries and proper distance crumbled into nothing. Rose tasted like honey and sin, like everything he'd denied himself in service to God and duty. When they broke apart, both breathless, Simon staggered backward as if burned. This cannot happen, he said, his voice rough with desire and desperation. Rose, you don't understand what you're asking. Rose's eyes blazed with determination. I understand perfectly. I'm asking you to stop hiding behind your collar and admit what we both know. She stepped forward, matching his retreat. I'm not your daughter, Simon. I never was. The village can go to hell. The profanity from her lips shocked them both, but Rose didn't back down. Do you think I care what they whisper? You think their opinions matter more than what we feel? Simon ran his hands through his hair, his carefully ordered world spinning out of control. I'm a man of God. I have responsibilities, a calling, and what about your calling to love? Rose demanded. Isn't that what you preach every Sunday? That love is the greatest commandment? Not this kind of love, Simon said desperately. This is... What? Wrong? Sinful? Rose's voice cracked with pain. Is that what you think of me? That loving me is a sin? The anguish in her voice nearly brought Simon to his knees. No, he whispered. God help me. No. You're the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me, Rose. But that's exactly why this has to stop. Over the following weeks, Simon threw himself into his pastoral duties with renewed fervor. As if by burying himself in prayer and service, he could silence the longing that consumed his every waking thought. He visited the sick, counseled the troubled, and delivered sermons with such passion that the congregation began to whisper about a religious revival. But at home, the tension between him and Rose grew unbearable. She moved through their shared space like a ghost, polite but distant, helping with his needs while carefully avoiding any touch or prolonged conversation. The easy companionship they'd shared was gone, replaced by a careful dance of avoidance. That left them both hollow. It was Jeremiah Thornton who finally forced the issue. The prosperous farmer arrived at the parsonage on a crisp November morning, his hat in his hands and determination in his weathered face. "Preacher Caldwell," he began formally, "I've come to ask for Rose's hand in marriage." Simon's hand stilled. Over the sermon he'd been writing. Through the window, he could see Rose hanging laundry in the small yard behind the church, her hair catching the pale sunlight like spun copper. "Have you spoken to Rose about this?" Simon asked carefully. Jeremiah shifted uncomfortably. "She's been ... reluctant to discuss the matter. Says she needs to think it over. But I'm a patient man, and I know a good woman when I see one." Simon forced himself to meet the other man's honest gaze. Jeremiah was everything Rose deserved. Kind, devoted, could give her children respectability. A future free from the whispers that would follow her if people ever suspected the truth about Simon's feelings. "She's free to make her own choice," Simon said finally. "I won't stand in her way if that's what she wants." But even as he spoke the words, his heart was breaking. That night, as he knelt in prayer before the altar, Simon begged God for the strength to do the right thing, to let Rose go, to release her into a proper marriage that would give her everything he never could. When he returned to the parsonage near midnight, he found Rose waiting for him in the kitchen, still dressed, but clearly having waited up for hours. "Jeremiah came to see you," she said without preamble. Simon nodded, not trusting his voice. "And what did you tell him?" "The choice is yours." Simon's voice was barely audible. "I won't force you into anything, Rose, but I won't stand in your way if you decide he's what you want." Rose studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something she didn't find. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but Simon could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "Then I'll marry him," she said. "If that's what you want me to do." The words hit Simon like a physical blow, but he forced himself to nod. I think it would be for the best." Neither of them slept that night, separated only by the thin wall between their rooms, but feeling as though an ocean had opened between them. The engagement announcement sent ripples of excitement through Millbrook Valley. Widow Persimmon clucked approvingly as she helped Rose select fabric for her wedding dress. The other churchwomen threw themselves into planning what promised to be the social event of the season. Only Simon seemed untouched by the celebration. He went through the motions of congratulating Jeremiah, of blessing the union from the pulpit, of smiling when the congregation spoke of how well-suited the couple seemed. But anyone who looked closely could see the way his hands shook during service. The dark circles under his eyes, the haunted look that had taken up permanent residence in his face. Rose threw herself into wedding preparations with grim determination. She smiled at Jeremiah's earnest courtship, accepted his chaste kisses on the cheek, and discussed their future farm life with appropriate enthusiasm. But Simon caught her sometimes, staring out the window with an expression of such profound sadness that it took all his strength not to gather her in his arms and damn the consequences. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding. Simon was working in his study when raised voices drew his attention to the front yard. Through the window, he saw Rose and Jeremiah in what appeared to be their first real argument. "I don't understand why you won't set the date for earlier," Jeremiah was saying, his usual patient demeanor cracking. "We could be married by Christmas, instead of waiting until spring." "I told you, I need time to prepare," Rose replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "That's not it, and we both know it." Jeremiah's weathered face was flushed with frustration. "You're always looking over your shoulder, Rose, always watching him." He jerked his head toward the parsonage. "Are you going to tell me what's really going on, or do I have to guess?" Rose went very still. "I don't know what you mean." "The hell you don't." Jeremiah's language made her flinch. "I've got eyes, woman. I see how you look at him, how he looks at you." If I didn't know better, I'd swear. He stopped abruptly, his face going pale as the implication of his words hit home. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Rose lifted her chin with a dignity that reminded Simon powerfully of the determined little girl who used to argue theology with visiting ministers. "If you don't trust me, Jeremiah, then perhaps we shouldn't be getting married at all." Rose. Wait, but she was already walking away. Leaving Jeremiah standing alone in the yard with his mouth open and his assumptions crumbling around him, Simon met her at the kitchen door, and the look in her eyes told him she was past pretending. "Knows," she said simply. Simon's blood ran cold. Knows what? Maybe not the details, but enough. "He sees the way we are together, Simon, the way we can't help being." Simon sank into a chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 49 years. "Rose, if word gets out, then let it." Her voice was fierce, reckless. "I'm tired of living a lie. I'm tired of pretending I could ever love anyone the way I love you." The words hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud after months of careful silence. Simon looked up at her, this woman who had been his salvation and was now his torment, and felt something break open in his chest. I can't marry him," Rose continued, her voice growing stronger. "I won't. Not when every time he touches me. I wish it was your hands on my skin. Not when every time he kisses me. I'm thinking about that night in this kitchen, when you finally admitted what we both knew." Simon stood slowly, his resolve crumbling like sand in the tide. "Rose, if we do this, if we acknowledge what this is, there's no going back. The congregation, the community, everything I've built here will be destroyed." Rose stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Then we'll build something new, somewhere else. Just us." The temptation was overwhelming. To leave Millbrook Valley, to start fresh somewhere no one knew their history, to finally claim the love that had been growing between them for years. Simon could picture it, a small cabin somewhere in the mountains, Rose in his arms without shame or secrecy, a life built on truth instead of careful lies. But the weight of his calling, 17 years of serving this community, pressed down on him like stones. "I need time to think," he said finally. Rose nodded, understanding but not backing down. "Don't think too long, Simon. Some chances don't come twice." That night, Simon walked among the graves behind the church, seeking guidance among the stones that marked lives lived and loves lost. When he finally returned to the parsonage, he found Rose's bedroom door standing open and her few belongings gone. On his desk was a single note. "I've gone to stay with Cordelia until you decide what kind of man you really are." 3 days without Rose felt like 3 years. The parsonage echoed with emptiness, every corner holding memories of her laughter, her questions, her presence that had made the simple rooms feel like home. Simon went through his duties mechanically, mourning. Prayers, visits to parishioners, preparation for Sunday's service, but his heart wasn't in any of it, the congregation noticed. How could they not, when their usually vibrant preacher delivered sermons with all the passion of a man reading grocery lists? When he forgot names he'd known for years, when his hands trembled so badly during communion that he spilled wine on the altar cloth. It was Deacon Cornelius Hartwell who finally cornered him after Wednesday evening service. "Simon, my boy," the elderly man said, his voice gentle but concerned. "You look like death warmed over. What's troubling you?" Simon almost laughed at the simple question. What wasn't troubling him? He was in love with the woman he'd raised from infancy, the woman everyone in town believed was his daughter. He was preparing to throw away everything he'd worked for, everything he believed in, for a love that most would consider an abomination. "Just tired, Cornelius," Simon managed. "Wedding preparations, you know." But the old deacon's eyes were sharp. Despite his 70 years, "This is about more than Rose marrying young Thornton, isn't it?" Simon's blood ran cold. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Cornelius studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Simon, I've been watching you since you came to this valley. Watched you grow from an eager young preacher into the man who holds this community together. And I've been watching you watch that girl." The words hit Simon like a physical blow. If Cornelius had noticed how many others had seen what he thought he'd hidden so carefully. "She's not your blood, Simon," Cornelius continued quietly. "We all know that. found her on the church steps, raised her out of Christian charity. But somewhere along the way, charity became something else, didn't it? Simon couldn't speak, could barely breathe. This was at the moment his carefully constructed world came crashing down. But instead of condemnation, Cornelius placed a weathered hand on Simon's shoulder. The heart wants what it wants, son. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know, Simon whispered. God help me. I don't know. Cornelius said dryly, I suggest you figure it out before that girl marries the wrong man. Out of spite. That evening, Simon found himself standing outside Widow Persimmon's cottage, his courage failing him at the last moment. Through the lighted windows he could see Rose sitting by the fireplace. Her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her face turned away from him, before he could knock.
Oh.
The door opened, and Cordelia appeared, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance with obvious disapproval.
Out time?
The old woman said tartly. Come in before you catch your death standing out there like a lovesick fool. The cottage was warm and cozy, filled with the scent of baking bread and lavender sachets. Rose looked up when he entered, and the hope that flashed in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. I'll make tea, Cordelia announced, bustling toward the kitchen with obvious deliberation. You two have talking to do. When they were alone, Simon didn't know where to begin. All his carefully rehearsed words had fled, leaving him standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, like the besotted fool he was. I broke it off with Jeremiah, Rose said quietly. This morning. Simon's heart lurched. Rose, he knew, Simon. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough. He said he wouldn't marry a woman who was in love with someone else. Rose's voice was steady, but Simon could see the tears gathering in her eyes. He was kinder about it then. I deserved. Simon moved closer, drawn by the pain in her voice. What did you tell him? The truth. Rose looked up at him, her green eyes blazing with defiance and determination. That I've been in love with you since I was 16 years old. That every day I spend pretending otherwise is a day wasted. That I'd rather be alone for the rest of my life than settle for someone who isn't you. The words hit him like lightning, illuminating truths he'd been trying to deny for years. Rose had been 16 when he first noticed the way she looked at him, when he first felt the stirrings of something more than paternal affection. He'd told himself it was wrong, inappropriate, a betrayal of the trust placed in him when he took her in. But looking at her now, this strong, passionate, beautiful woman who had chosen him over security, over respectability, over everything most women wanted, Simon finally understood what he'd been too frightened to admit. He loved her. Not as a father loves a daughter, not as a guardian loves his ward, but as a man loves a woman, completely, desperately, with every fiber of his being. Rose, he said, his voice rough with emotion, if we do this, there's no going back. The scandal. The whispers. The loss of everything we've known here. I know. She stood slowly, moving toward him with deliberate grace. Do you think I haven't counted the cost? You think I don't know what we'll be giving up? Simon reached out almost involuntarily, his fingers tangling in her hair the way he'd dreamed of doing for years. And you're willing to pay that price? Rose's smile was radiant, transforming her face with joy and determination. For you, or us, I'd pay any price. This time, when their lips met, Simon didn't pull away. The kiss was everything Simon had imagined, and more desperate, tender, filled with years of denied longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rose's eyes were bright with tears of joy. We'll have to leave, Simon said, his forehead resting against hers. Start over somewhere else, I know. Rose's voice was steady. Sure. Thinking about it for weeks. There's a settlement out in Oregon Territory, new communities, people building fresh lives. We could go there, say we're married already, no one would question it. Simon marveled at her practicality, her courage. While he'd been wrestling with guilt and propriety, she'd been planning their future with clear-eyed determination. What about your things? The life you've built here? Rose shrugged, a gesture that managed to be both careless and profound. What life, Simon? Helping you with church duties while pretending not to love you, watching other women find happiness. While I pine away for something I thought I could never have, She cupped his face in her hands. This is my life. Right here, right now, with you. Over the next week, they made their plans in secret. Simon would resign from his position, citing a calling to missionary work in the Western Territories. Rose would pack only what was essential, leaving behind the elaborate trousseau that had been prepared for her. Wedding to Jeremiah. The hardest part was telling Cordelia. The old widow listened in silence as Rose explained their decision, her weathered face revealing nothing of her thoughts. When the explanation was finished, Cordelia was quiet for so long that Rose began to fidget nervously. "You're sure about this?" Cordelia finally asked. "Both of you?" Simon nodded. "We are. And you understand what you're giving up? Not just the material things, but the respect, the community, the security of a known life?" "We understand," Rose said quietly. "But Cordelia, I can't live a lie anymore. I can't marry a good man while loving someone else. It wouldn't be fair to anyone." Cordelia studied them both for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing, the way Simon's hand rested protectively on Rose's shoulder, the way Rose leaned into his touch without conscious thought, the rightness that seemed to emanate from them when they were together. "Well," she said, "finally, I suppose stranger things have happened." And anyone with eyes could see this was inevitable. She stood abruptly, moving to an old chest in the corner of the room. "If you're going to do this full thing, you might as well do it right." From the chest, she withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a wedding ring, simple gold, worn smooth by years of wear. "This was my grandmother's," Cordelia said gruffly. "She eloped with my grandfather back in 1802, caused the biggest scandal the county had ever seen. Lived to celebrate their 50th anniversary." She pressed the ring into Simon's palm. "Maybe it'll bring you better luck than common sense." Rose threw her arms around the old woman, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. Ow. For understanding." "Understanding's got nothing to do with it," Cordelia replied, but her voice was gentle. "Love's got its own logic, child. Always has." The following Sunday, Simon delivered his final sermon to the congregation of Millbrook Valley. He spoke of new beginnings, of God's calling leading people to unexpected places, of the courage required to follow one's true path, even when it meant leaving comfort behind. Few in the congregation knew he was really talking about himself. After the service, as people filed out with their usual pleasant farewells and invitations to Sunday dinner, Deacon Hartwell lingered behind. "You're really doing this?" he said quietly. Simon met the old man's eyes steadily. "I am." Cornelius nodded slowly. "She's a good woman, Simon. Anyone can see that. And you've been the best preacher this valley's ever had. If this is what you need to do to be happy, then I reckon the Lord understands better than the rest of us might." It was as close to a blessing as Simon was likely to get, and he treasured it. That night, as he packed his few belongings by lamplight, Simon felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in months, the constant tension that had been eating at him was gone. Tomorrow, he and Rose would begin the journey west, toward a new life and a love they could finally claim openly. He picked up Cordelia's ring from where it lay on his desk, holding it up to catch the light. Such a small thing to represent such a momentous change. But then, the most important changes often started small, with a baby left on church steps, at a glance that lasted too long, with the courage to finally speak the truth that had been living in two hearts for years. The wagon creaked steadily westward along the rutted trail, carrying Simon and Rose away from everything they had ever known, toward a future that existed only in their hopes and determination. They had been traveling for 3 weeks, joining a small group of families heading to the Oregon Territory, and with each mile that passed, the weight of their old life lifted a little more from their shoulders. Rose sat beside Simon on the wagon seat, her hand resting lightly on his arm, no longer concerned about propriety or appearances. To their fellow travelers, they were simply Simon and Rose Caldwell, a married couple seeking new opportunities in the West. The fiction had become so natural that sometimes Simon almost forgot it was a lie. almost the truth was. They had not yet spoken vows before God or man. They had shared tender kisses and whispered confessions of love. But Simon's respect for the sacred bonds of marriage, given their unusual circumstances, had held him back from claiming Rose as his wife in anything but name, she understood. Patient as always with his struggles of conscience, but he could see the question in her eyes growing stronger with each passing day. How long would they maintain this careful distance? How long before the love that had driven them from their home demanded its full expression? The answer came on a rain-soaked evening when they made camp beside a rushing creek. All the other families had drawn their wagons into the usual protective circle, but a fierce storm had blown in from the west. Forcing everyone to seek shelter wherever they could find it, Simon and Rose huddled together in the back of their wagon. Listening to the thunder roll across the sky like the voice of God himself, Rose was pressed close against his side, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Simon," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm, "are you having second thoughts?" He looked down at her, startled by the question. "About leaving? About us?" "Never." "Then why do you still pull away from me?" Her green eyes searched his face in the dim light from their small lantern. "We're hundreds of miles from anyone who knew us before. We're traveling as man and wife, but you still treat me like what? Like something you're afraid to touch?" The pain in her voice cut him to the quick. "Do you still see me as that little girl you found on the church steps?" Simon's arms tightened around her instinctively. "Rose, you know that's not true. Then what is it? What's holding you back?" Simon was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain drum against the wagon canvas. How could he explain the complex tangle of reverence, desire, and lingering guilt that warred in his heart? How could he tell her that loving her felt both like the most natural thing in the world and the most profound transformation of everything he had believed about himself? "I want to do this right," he said finally. "You deserve more than stolen moments and hidden kisses. You deserve vows spoken in the light before God and witnesses, with nothing shameful or secret about it." Rose was quiet for so long that Simon began to worry he had said the wrong thing. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Simon Caldwell," she said, turning to face him fully. "Do you think I care about ceremonies and witnesses? Do you think I need a preacher's blessing to know that what we have is sacred?" Before he could answer, she placed her hands on either side of his face, her touch gentle but determined. "I, Rose, take you, Simon, to be my husband," she said clearly, her eyes never leaving his. "To love and to cherish, in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, for as long as we both shall live. Before God and my own heart, I pledge myself to you." The simple words, spoken in their tiny shelter, with only the storm as witness, hit Simon with more force than any elaborate church ceremony could have managed. This was Rose choosing him, claiming him, making their love real in the most fundamental way possible. "Rose," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Now you," she said firmly, "if you mean it, if you really want me as your wife." Simon looked into her eyes, these eyes that had watched him grow from earnest young preacher to conflicted middle-aged man, that had seen all his doubts and fears and loved him anyway, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. "Simon, take you, Rose, to be my wife," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "To love and to cherish, to protect and to honor, in all circumstances and for all time. Before God and by the love that brought us together, I pledge myself." To you, the kiss that followed was different from all the others, not stolen or guilty, but claimed and celebrated. When they broke apart, both were crying, but their tears were tears of joy and relief, and the profound recognition that they had finally, truly come home to each other. Outside, the storm began to subside, and through a break in the clouds, a single star appeared, bright and steady in the clearing sky. 3 months later, they arrived in the small settlement of Cedar Falls, Oregon Territory, where Simon's skills as a preacher and Rose's talents as a healer and teacher made them welcome additions to the growing community. They built a small cabin on the hill overlooking the town, with a garden for Rose and a study for Simon, and windows that caught the morning light just the way Rose had always dreamed. The townspeople accepted them without question as the devoted married couple they appeared to be. Simon preached with a joy and passion that drew people from miles around, while Rose established a school for the settlement's children and used her knowledge of herbs and healing to tend the sick. On their first wedding anniversary of that storm-lashed night when they had spoken their private vows, surprised Rose with Cordelia's ring, properly resized and polished to gleaming perfection. "I know we're already married in every way that matters," he said as he slipped it onto her finger, "but I wanted you to have something beautiful to mark what we've built together." Rose held up her hand, admiring the way the gold caught the lamplight. "It's perfect," she said. Then, with the mischievous smile that had been charming him for 20 years, she added, "Though I have to say, our first wedding was much more romantic than I expected a second one to be." Simon laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Only you would call getting married in the back of a wagon during a thunderstorm romantic." "It was perfect," Rose insisted, standing on her toes to kiss him. Everything about it was perfect. And looking back, Simon had to agree. They had lost everything they had known before their community, their security, their carefully constructed life, but they had gained something infinitely more precious. They had gained each other, fully and completely, without shame or secrecy. 5 years later, as Simon watched Rose teaching their 3-year-old daughter Mercy to tend the garden behind their expanded cabin, he marveled at how perfectly their life had unfolded. The little girl had Rose's auburn hair and Simon's gentle nature, and she chattered away to the vegetables as if they were old friends. "Papa," Mercy called, waving a handful of carrots in his direction. "Mama says these are ready for soup." Simon smiled, setting down his pen and the sermon he'd been writing. Through the open window of his study, he could see the entire valley spread out below them. Fields golden with grain, a settlement bustling with activity, the river winding like a silver ribbon toward the distant mountains. This was the life. They had chosen the life they had built from love and courage and the willingness to start over. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was better than anything they could have imagined. Rose looked up from the garden, soil on her hands and joy in her eyes, and Simon felt his heart swell with gratitude. 22 years ago, God had placed a crying baby on his church steps. He had thought he was saving her, giving her a home and a future. Now he understood the truth. Rose had been saving him all along, as he stepped outside to join his wife and daughter in their garden. Simon offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving. Some love stories began with chance meetings or careful courtship. Theirs had begun with abandonment and providence, grown through years of silent longing, and blossomed into something that transformed them both. It was, he reflected as Rose slipped her hand into his and Mercy ran between them laughing, exactly the kind of miracle he had always believed in but never dared hope he might live. Their love had survived scandal, distance, and the weight of impossible circumstances. It would endure whatever the future might bring, as constant as the mountains that surrounded their valley, as enduring as the faith that had brought them together and kept them strong. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.